Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
Despite my own upbringing, I come from a long line of farmers. Both my mom and my dad's sides of the family have had family farms going back generations. My aunts and uncles are primarily responsible for the farms now, and even my aging grandparents do what they can to keep things running. You might imagine their disappointment when my mom and dad chose to move away to pursue jobs in the city after they got married. My dad is an English professor at a community college, and my mom is a counselor specializing in cognitive behavioral therapy. Other than occasional day trips out to my dad's family farm when I was growing up, I had little exposure to the type of environment he and my mom had grown up in. We visited my dad's family farm more often because his dad, my granddad, had health problems and needed more help than my mom's side of the family. Recently, however, my aunt on my mom's side of the family fell ill, and my Uncle John asked if we could lend a hand around the farm. I jumped at the opportunity when he asked because growing up in the city, I had always been interested in farm life. Something about caring for animals and working outside seemed like the sort of thing that would make me feel accomplished at the end of the day. My uncle's farm has a large stock of poultry, mostly chickens, and I had never worked with chickens at my dad's family farm. As you might expect, there was also a fair amount of work that needed to be done out in the barnyard and the pastures. The thought of doing this type of work appealed to me far more than spending my days inside reading or writing papers for school. Dad dropped me off at the farm after lunch one Saturday afternoon, and I spent most of my time helping Uncle John clean out chicken coops, feed cows, weed gardens, and various other tasks around the property. We stayed until late into the evening, just as the sun began to set behind the trees. It wasn't long before we headed back over to the house to shower and get something to eat. When we stepped out of the truck, we were greeted by a beautiful sky full of stars and a cool breeze rustling through the leaves. I couldn't remember ever seeing a night so clear and perfect. The moon cast just enough light to make it easy to see where you were going without tripping over anything in your path. Uncle John seemed satisfied and ready to unwind for the evening, soaking up the moonlight like it was a warm bath after a long day of hard work. The sound of crickets and cicadas could have lulled me to sleep. That tranquil moment was broken when I heard the strangest sound I had ever heard come from an animal. At least I thought it was an animal. It sounded exactly like someone clearing their throat, except it didn't stop. I looked around the yard, trying to determine which direction the noise was coming from. Uncle John shrugged, not having noticed the sound, but then I heard it again. I followed the sound a few feet down the driveway toward the road, where I saw movement. A dark figure slowly walked along the side of the road, keeping close to the shadows. It prowled on 4 legs and appeared to be carrying something, but I couldn't tell what it was. Its head turned as it made its way down the road and disappeared behind a stand of trees. I stood still, listening to the silence for a moment, not knowing if I should go investigate or stay put. I decided to follow the figure as far as I could, watching it disappear under the tree line. As I got closer, I could see that it carried something that glowed softly in the darkness. As the creature slipped away into the dark, the glow dulled until it vanished completely. As I walked back to Uncle John, he gestured toward me and said he had seen coyotes a few times over the past few weeks, so we should go in for the night. The next day, all I could think about was what I had seen. I really didn't know what I had been looking at, but it didn't strike me as very coyote-like. The way it moved seemed almost like a human on 2 legs. I tried to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been real. There was no doubt in my mind that I would need to find out what this thing was. That day was about the same as the day before as we continued our work. After supper, my uncle told me to gather up some supplies and meet him back at the old barn. He wanted to show me something he had found while cleaning out the barn. I grabbed a flashlight and followed him as he led me to the back wall of the barn where there was a large wooden door. He opened the doors and we stepped inside, being careful not to trip over anything. The light from my uncle's flashlight illuminated a large room filled with tools, machinery, hay bales, and various other items. He pulled a large box out of the corner and set it down on the dusty concrete floor beside me, then went to rummage through several more boxes stacked against the wall. I stood there dumbfounded, wondering what was in the box. I heard a scratching sound from inside the box and felt uneasy as my uncle began to open it in front of me. When the lid lifted, I nearly gasped. What stared back at me was covered by a sheet of black material, but looked very much like an impossible mixture of a pig, a goat, and a chicken. It was hard to tell exactly what it was, but it seemed like it might have been born recently, the way Uncle John seemed to have been incubating it. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Uncle John laughed nervously. "It's a baby lamb," he replied. I squinted at the little creature. It looked like it was asleep, curled up on top of the blanket. "Where did you get it? Why are you keeping it here?" Uncle John scratched his head. "Well, it's sort of a long story." "Tell me anyway," I urged him. Uncle John sat down on one of the bales. "This started about 5 years ago when I was driving back from Denver one evening, and I stopped at a little roadside farm market to pick up some fresh produce. I was just about to leave when I noticed a sign advertising fresh lamb. I figured it would make a nice change from the usual cuts I used to buy, so I bought a couple of pounds and brought them home." "And what happened next?" I asked impatiently. "Well, I was going to cook it right away, but when I cut it up, I realized I didn't have any good recipes for lamb, so I ended up throwing it in the freezer instead. About a month later, I took it out to thaw, and I still wasn't sure what to do with it. Finally, I decided to make a stew, but when I went down to the basement to check on the water level in the crock pot, I saw a bunch of old jars and cans in the back of the cupboard, and then the thought hit me. I thought of the way scientists might preserve animals in formaldehyde, and I decided to put the cut of lamb in a jar." "Did it work?" I asked. He shrugged. "Not exactly, but it worked enough to keep the meat preserved for the time being." But what really interested me was how well preserved the lamb was. In fact, it was so well preserved that the muscle fibers seemed to twitch and writhe in the jar. I watched it for quite a while, fascinated by the way it moved, but eventually I got bored and left it alone. Then about 6 months later, I came across another advertisement for fresh lamb, and I decided to go back and see if I could find the jar. When I finally did, I found that the jar was empty, and the lamb was gone. I couldn't believe my eyes. I'd spent all this money on this lamb, and now it was gone. "Okay, so what does that have to do with this thing?" I asked. In the spirit of scientific inquiry, I decided to repeat the test, this time with cuts of pork. Truthfully, I didn't know what sort of liquid the previous specimen sat in. I thought it was a preservative, but it was just stored in an old jar I found out here. I took a cut of pork and submerged it in the liquid and watched over the coming weeks as the muscles began twitching to life like the lamb did before it. I assumed that maybe foxes or raccoons got into the barn and took the specimen when I discovered it was also missing one day. I rubbed my chin. "Then why are you keeping this in a box in the barn?" "That's where it gets complicated," he said. He picked up a handful of papers from the bottom of the box and handed them to me. They were typed pages, each with a different heading. The first read problems. Another one had experiments. There was also one that simply read, the experiment. "Is this the same experiment?" I asked. He nodded. "Basically, I've been working on the project every day since last summer, ever since I started noticing the phenomenon." I skimmed through the articles, and I began to understand why Uncle John was so secretive about the subject. He was conducting experiments on live specimens, on human beings. "How many people have you done this to?" I asked. He pursed his lips. "I don't know. Maybe a dozen, no more than 20. Human specimens aren't exactly the easiest thing to come by, but I need the genetic material." I felt like I was in danger, so I began to subtly move backward toward the barn door. I reached out and grabbed the handle, but just then a deep rumbling noise sounded from inside the barn. It was as if the whole structure was shaking from the vibrations of 1,000 giant footsteps. "What's that?" I cried. "Nothing," Uncle John replied quickly. "Just the wind." I didn't believe him. I knew there was something wrong with this place, something much worse than what I saw the night before. "Would you mind telling me what this is all about? What are you doing?" "I promise I don't want to hurt you, Stephen," he said, slowly trudging toward me. "I'm just trying to find a solution to a problem I've run into. This is all my fault. If I hadn't been so curious about these creatures, none of this would be happening." I backed away until I was pressed against the door. My heart was pounding furiously in my chest. I glanced at the window, but it was too dark to see anything. Uncle John stopped about 10 feet away from me and stared at the floor. His face was pale and sweaty, and his hands were trembling. I noticed that the hair on his head was sticking straight up, almost like the mane of a lion. "Stephen, look at me," he said in a low voice. He took a step closer. "No!" I screamed. I dashed toward the door, narrowly escaping his grasp, and was able to make it outside. Astonishingly, the sky had darkened since we entered the barn, and I heard the roaring echoes of what sounded like 1,000 pigs squealing. It was dark, but bright enough for me to see the abominations around me. The putrid stench of these creatures was enough to make me gag and cover my face, though that did very little to mask it. They were a variety of shapes and sizes, some large and bulky, others small and slender. Some looked a bit like hogs, but had arms like featherless chicken wings, and most had cavernous heads with inconsistent numbers of eyes. Their feet were clawed hooves, and their bodies were covered in a sickening mixture of thick fur and internal organs made external. One of them stepped forward, holding its ground even though I was a few yards away. Its body was covered in bristles, which I soon realized were not merely hairs, but long, pointed spines that ran down its back and legs. I felt Uncle John's hand on my shoulder and tried to jerk away as fast as I could, but tripped over one of the smaller creatures. As I fell, I landed directly on top of the creature. It let out a strange, warbling cry and was immediately joined by another. A pair of them scurried toward me while the rest remained behind, watching from the darkness. One of the two closest to me lay on top of me, scratching and pawing at me with its claws. I rolled off onto my side and pushed myself up, trying to get away. The next thing I knew, I was lying face first in the dirt. I turned over, thinking I'd escaped, but another creature jumped on my back, knocking me to the ground again. I struggled to get out from under them, but they were so heavy and strong that I couldn't lift my head. I kicked and punched the creatures as hard as I could, and they responded by grabbing hold of me and clinging to my limbs. I felt like a pinball being bounced around between them. Suddenly, something heavy dropped onto the top of my head, and I lost consciousness. When I came to, I was lying in the grass. I lifted my head, and my first thought was that I had fallen asleep and was dreaming. There were no monsters or beasts nearby. Even the moon had disappeared. I got to my feet and looked around. I wasn't completely sure where I was, but it seemed to be an open field near Uncle John's farm. It was a silent, still, and desolate place. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed, and there wasn't even any wind. It was then that I noticed a well nearby, about 20 feet behind me to my right. It would have been hard not to notice, considering the stench coming from it. I walked toward it, knowing I probably wouldn't like seeing whatever the smell was coming from. As I peeked over the edge, I saw some sort of greenish-yellow liquid. It seemed to be bubbling, and I tried to get a better look at what might be in the liquid, but the sky was too dark to make out much more than the color and the bubbling. As I leaned over the edge, I felt hands gripping my shoulders on both sides, pulling me backward. A rush of horror, followed by extreme relief, washed over me when I realized the hands weren't Uncle John's, but my dad's. "Hey, I was already on my way over when I got a call from Uncle John saying you were hurt helping around the farm. I'm glad I was so close when he called. Perfect luck, right? How you doing now, Steve?" In a daze, I stood up, brushed off some of the dirt and grass on my shirt and my pants, and said, I don't know. "You've had a hard day. Let's get you back home." Go ahead and sit in the car and I'll let everyone know we're heading home." Dad and I walked back to the car he parked nearby, and I sat in the passenger seat, anxiously waiting to get home as quickly as I could. Dad talked to Uncle John and made a gesture showing we were going to leave. Uncle John scratched the top of his head and shrugged before raising a single hand to me to say goodbye. My dad got into the car, and we drove down the gravel road toward the gate. In the distance, I heard pigs squealing. Whatever I had just encountered was haunting. The stench was burned into my memory. I didn't know exactly how Uncle John was making these things, or why he needed human specimens, but I didn't want to find out. I was just grateful to finally be away from the barn. Seeing how bright the moon was without all of the city's light pollution reminded me of my encounter with whatever creature I had seen the previous night. I looked at Dad for a moment before looking out the window again, and said, "I can see why you and Mom decided to take jobs in the city." "Farm life isn't for everyone, Steve," he replied. "But as someone who always loved getting his hands dirty, Uncle John was made for it."
Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
When I was growing up in my parents' house with my little brother, there was never a time that we didn't have pets. There were always dogs in the house. Boxers, Irish setters, German shepherds, you name it, we had one. We also had cats, Siamese, Persian, Himalayan. But for a short time, my favorite was a goldfish I bought with my own money when I was 14. I had saved up money from Christmas and birthday cards so that I could buy a small tank with a filter and have a pet that was really just for me. I was excited to go shopping for a goldfish, and when I picked a goldfish at the store, I even gave him a name before the employee even scooped him out of the tank. Because he was shaped a little bit differently than the other fish, and he had an unusually large white head with prominent black eyes, I named him Eyes. I bought all the supplies for Eyes and put them into his new home. As soon as I got home, I set everything up on the kitchen table while my family ate dinner. My family is usually pretty talkative during dinner, but that night my mom was unusually quiet. At first, I thought maybe someone was sick or something. Maybe my grandmother had fallen down or something. In the back of my mind, though, I knew something else was wrong, because no one said anything about my mom's odd behavior. The family conversation went on like normal while Mom sat at the table staring at the aquarium. She looked like she was crying, but her face was dry. Her hands shook whenever she picked up a piece of food and turned it over in her hand. The way she stared at the goldfish while making these strange repetitive motions made it seem like she was on autopilot. After dinner, when my mother went to make sandwiches for lunch the next day, I followed behind her. She was still staring at the aquarium as she took out the bread from the pantry. I stood silently by the counter, watching until my mom finally spoke. "You know, I've been thinking," she said. "Maybe we shouldn't get any more pets." I asked her what was wrong, and she told me we just had too many animals in the house. My dad must have been just as confused as I was, because he intervened and pointed out how I had been saving up for a while and showed a lot of responsibility. She gave in, and I ended up moving Eyes into my room. It wasn't long after that I noticed my mom continued acting strangely around the aquarium. She didn't watch Eyes anymore. Instead, she focused her attention on whatever else she could focus on in the room, as long as she didn't look at the goldfish. Then one day, when I came home from school, my mom was sitting alone in the living room, staring at the aquarium. I asked why she had moved Eyes into the living room, and she said it was easier to see him there instead of my bedroom. I agreed with her and sat next to her. She leaned against my shoulder and rested her head on my chest. She told me not to worry. I was totally caught off guard, because even just the day before, she seemed to go out of her way to avoid looking at my goldfish, and now she wanted it in the living room for everyone to see? It was almost as if she felt guilty about something. Later that evening, when my dad got home from work, My mother told him the same thing she'd told me earlier. She just wanted the whole family to be able to see the aquarium. For the next few days, my mom's behavior became more and more strange. She would sit in front of the aquarium and stare at it for hours. When she wasn't doing that, she was cleaning it obsessively. One morning, I woke up early and found her kneeling next to the aquarium holding the hose. I asked her what she was doing, and she told me she was washing his fins. I tried to ask her where she learned about cleaning fish, but she wouldn't answer me. All she said was, "Just trust me." One afternoon, I came home from school and went right to the living room to find my mom sitting in the corner of the couch, staring at the aquarium. When I asked her if she was okay, she told me that she was fine. Before I could talk further, she told me to come to her. When I did, she led me to the bathroom. She pointed out the toilet and told me to sit on top of it. When I asked her what I was supposed to do, she pulled open the lid. The water was cloudy, with something floating inside. She reached inside and picked up a small eyeball. She had it in her palm for a moment, closed her eyes, and then threw it into the toilet. She told me I should never be afraid of death, and she turned away and left the bathroom without saying another word. I cautiously walked back into the living room, expecting to find the aquarium empty, like what my mom just did was a sick way to explain that my goldfish died. But to my surprise, my goldfish was perfectly fine swimming around the tank. Because he was such a unique goldfish, there was no way that this was just a replacement to cover up the death of my goldfish. I just couldn't understand what had just happened in the bathroom. My mom had her hands and face pressed up against the aquarium. Her forehead was pressed into the glass like a child seeing their first dolphin show in the splash zone. I had never seen her smile that way. Her mouth hung open, and her eyes frantically followed my goldfish every time he would even move slightly. Once in a while, the movement would stop for a second, and she would lean forward and press her nose harder against the glass, and then eyes would swim again. She sat there in silence for what seemed like forever, until she finally let out a small laugh. She looked over at me and smiled, telling me she was sorry she hadn't told me sooner, but it was such a joy watching eyes swim. I asked her what was so funny, and she told me that she had just realized that she was finally happy. She coughed like she was trying to clear her throat, and for a second it looked like she had spit something out, but quickly wiped her mouth. I asked her if she was all right and whether she needed to lie down, but she quickly wiped her mouth again and said she was fine, before returning to being pressed up against the aquarium. I noticed when she went back to the aquarium that she seemed to have been trying to hide something. I put my right arm around her shoulder and did my best to hide the fact that I was trying to see what she might have been hiding. I could only see it for a moment before she had seen my reflection in the aquarium glass and violently pushed away what she was hiding, and it was no longer in my line of sight. Then she returned to the aquarium again and continued staring in silence, as though nothing had happened. I sat in shock, replaying the previous moment in my head. What I had seen was repulsive. My mom had coughed up several small fish bones and 3 or 4 small black fish eyes and was trying to hide them from me. I didn't know whether she was eating small fish or how she was getting these parts, but the thought made me sick. I looked into the aquarium and saw the goldfish was directly in front of my mom's face. She stared at him like an idol. He seemed to stare back like the two were stuck in time. This went on for at least a minute before Eyes opened his mouth, and he spit out what seemed like a small black fisheye. I had no idea whether this was where my mom had gotten what she had coughed up, and I didn't have much time to figure it out before my dad and little brother walked through the front door. "Hey guys, what's up?" my dad asked. My mom stood up, wiped her hands on the front of her long blue skirt, and walked over to hug my dad. I couldn't believe how quickly her strange behavior changed, as though someone had flipped a switch in her head. I heard the quick pounding steps of my little brother going upstairs to his room, and I turned to look into the aquarium. The goldfish swam around like he usually did, and I saw him swallow something that had been floating in the water. I assumed it was whatever he coughed up before my dad and brother walked in. That night, I decided to move the aquarium back into my room. though having it in my room made me feel incredibly uneasy. When my mom and dad asked why I decided to move it back, I tried to play it off by saying I would feel more relaxed with the aquarium in my room. But the truth was that I wanted to keep eyes as far away from my mom as possible. That explanation seemed to be sufficient, because my mom didn't bring it up again, and even put out a few picture frames and some candles on the small table the aquarium had been on in the living room. It was as though she went from being completely obsessed to disinterested overnight. My mom's behavior returned to normal, but the image of her face pressed up against the glass stuck with me. Still, I always wondered whether eyes was the cause of this strange behavior, rather than some issue my mom was dealing with out of nowhere. Even so, I was always cautious to keep my bedroom door closed, and I avoided having company in my room as much as I could. I'm sure my parents thought it was just me being a teenager and needing my space, but the hidden reason haunted me until I finally moved out of my parents' house into my first apartment. It was then that I decided to put up an ad online offering to rehome my goldfish and include the whole aquarium setup. First come, first serve. The next day, I was helping the new owner carry the tank to his truck, and as I watched the truck turn out of my apartment complex, I felt unburdened and clean, never having to see the aquarium and relive that moment again. I considered getting a cat to keep me company, but I chose to enjoy my new freedom without having to worry about the challenge of being a pet owner. My parents still come to visit me and drop off the occasional care package, just to make sure that I'm taking care of myself while I'm in school, so it's not like I'm desperate for company. There is still one thing that makes me feel uneasy when they come to visit. Every so often, my mom will ask if I ever plan on getting another aquarium, and I always decline. But every time, she seems disappointed and says the same thing. That's too bad. I always loved eyes.
Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
Earlier this year, I found myself in need of a new pair of headphones. I usually avoid buying from sites other than the big ones with free 2-day shipping, but just this once, I decided to give something else a try. I'd heard from my friends for the longest time that they often buy from a site that sells products that usually end up on the big online stores after being repackaged and marked up. So I finally decided it was time for me to check out what all the fuss was about. I found a pair that was advertised as having sound quality that rivals headphones that would usually sell for $200 or $300, and the padded ear cups in the photos looked like they would probably be comfortable to wear for long sessions. Even better was the fact that they were only $6. I was skeptical and thought that the price was probably a sign of the quality, but I bought the headphones anyway. Weeks passed, and to nobody's surprise, when my headphones arrived, there was something wrong. The headphones seemed like a different pair entirely than the pair that I had ordered, and to top it off, these looked more like earmuffs than headphones. To make matters worse, there wasn't anything about their design that made them particularly comfortable either. Instead, they felt rough and heavy. I assumed there must have been a mistake when my order was processed, or that maybe I'd been scammed. I contacted customer service using the Contact Us form on their website, asking if I could exchange them for the headphones I'd actually paid for. A few hours later, after waiting impatiently for a response, I received one saying that the company doesn't do exchanges, and that I should contact the manufacturer directly. The problem was that there was no information about who manufactured the headphones in any of the packaging the headphones came with. All I knew for sure was that they weren't even close to the product described on the website. As I sat there planning on just cutting my losses, my phone rang. I checked the caller ID, and it seemed like someone was calling me back to help with my exchange. I answered right away, hoping that someone would help me get what I originally ordered, but the woman on the other end of the line said she worked for the company that made the headphones, and that the best thing I could do was return them to the store where I purchased them. I explained that the online store I bought them from told me the same thing, and the line went silent. I could hear her breathing, and it sounded like she was shuffling things around in front of her, so I knew she was still there, but she never responded. "Hello?" I asked, hoping she just got distracted and would tell me how I could get a refund, but when she finally responded, she scoffed and began to laugh like she had just heard a joke I wasn't in on. Then she hung up. I tried calling the number back, but it just rang without anyone picking up. I sat feeling defeated, but figured I was only out $6 and I just needed to move on with my day. I was tempted to just throw away the headphones, but I figured I'd at least been sent something, so I might as well see if they were any good. I inspected them to see if there was any way to plug them into my phone or at least connect to Bluetooth, but all I could find were wires that didn't seem to end anywhere outside of the headband or the ear cups. Despite not being able to connect them to my phone, I put them on to see if they would at least work as a decent pair of earmuffs. When I put them on, nothing happened at first, which was expected since I couldn't figure out how to connect them. But suddenly, and without any warning, I heard faint voices in my head. Very quiet whispers, but distinct enough for me to recognize. One voice sounded like it belonged to a woman who was crying and praying for someone. Another voice spoke calmly, as if the speaker was trying to console whoever it was that was whispering in my ear. As strange as it was, I felt compelled to listen. One voice that sounded like it belonged to a man said, "You don't need to worry." He sounded very reassuring, and his tone was pleasant, almost comforting, though I couldn't understand how I was hearing the voice in my head. At the same time, it seemed to come from somewhere else, not inside my own head, and somehow outside of the headphones. I removed them and became more aware of my surroundings, realizing I had nearly forgotten I was sitting on the couch in my living room when I first put them on. It reminded me of times when I was a kid, and I realized while watching a movie that my brain seemed to filter out everything in front of me other than the screen. But now that I had taken the headphones off, my apartment looked the same as it did before I had put them on. I decided to try listening to the voices again, this time paying closer attention to what they were talking about. But the second time I put them on, I could hardly hear the voices over a sort of humming sound. It sounded like somebody deep in meditation, but much louder. In fact, it was so loud that it drowned out all the other sounds and voices, and even made it difficult to distinguish one thought from another. My head started gently pounding, and I took the headphones off to give myself a break since I couldn't understand the voices this time anyway. I wondered if the humming had less to do with the sound coming from the headphones and more to do with the beginning stages of a migraine. I took the headphones off and tried again to see if I might have overlooked any carefully concealed buttons or any other way to connect the headphones to something, but I still couldn't find where the wires ended. I put the headphones back on and walked to the bathroom to find something to help with the migraine, then made my way to my bedroom. Still wearing the headphones, I threw myself onto the bed and turned off my bedside lamp so I could try to sleep off the pain that was rapidly expanding behind my left eye. In what must have been a matter of minutes, I felt like I was in a dream, but unlike most lucid dreams, I didn't have any control over my own body or where I was. I looked up and saw long fluorescent light bulbs and rectangular ceiling tiles. It seemed like I was lying in some sort of bed, but when I tried moving my arms to lift myself up, nothing happened. It was then that I realized I was lying in a hospital bed. When I looked down at my body, I saw that I was covered in tubes attached to various parts of my body. My arm, my chest, my legs. There was also a bag strapped to my stomach. Because it seemed like there was nothing I could do, I just observed the room filled with medical devices and the sound of a heart monitor. The door swung open, and I could see a nurse walk in. She was middle-aged, in her 40s maybe, and appeared to be rather attractive, but she wore a stern expression. "How are we doing today, Mr. O'Malley?" she asked. She waited a moment and continued. "Your parents stopped by earlier. They're worried sick about you, so let's get you up and moving, all right?" She started walking around the room while looking over a chart that she was carrying around, and began checking the displays of the machines I was hooked up to. Without even a glance at me for brief eye contact, she said, "The good news is that you're looking better today than when you came in. Let's just keep that up, all right?" I saw her inject some sort of liquid into the IV bag that was attached to me. and I thought I heard her starting to speak to me again, but her words became distorted, and I could hardly remember a word she said after she said it. A moment later, I woke up in my own bed. The headache was gone, and aside from my ears ringing, I felt great. In fact, it was like I woke up with a new sense of clarity despite not immediately remembering much about my dream. It wasn't until later that day that seeing the headphones made me remember the strange events in my bedroom and the dream of being in a hospital bed. I began to wonder if the headphones played a role in my dream. I had heard about something called binaural beats and how listening to different frequencies could impact a person's sleep, so I figured that must have been what I experienced. On the other hand, I still couldn't find any way to connect the headphones to anything, so I couldn't explain how it would be possible for them to play recordings of the voices, unless these came pre-programmed like a pair of display headphones. The next week or so was mostly like any other week, though I'd periodically put the headphones on to see if I could solve the mystery of how these things really worked. A lot of the time, wearing the headphones gave me a headache, probably because the tightness of the headband. Despite this, one evening I decided to test whether wearing the headphones to sleep would cause a dream similar to the one I had before, so I turned out the lights, put on the headphones, and drifted off to sleep. It seemed like no time had passed between when I laid my head on the pillow and when I began to dream. As soon as I opened my eyes, I only saw a dim glow, a soft white light that felt soothing and comforting. I tried to sit up, but again, I was stuck in a hospital bed being monitored. The same nurse as before, as well as a doctor and two other people who also looked like nurses, were staring intently at one of the displays for the equipment attached to me. They spoke softly, and after a moment, I knew they were talking about me. As I listened, they talked about how I had been involved in an accident that I couldn't recall, which left me in a coma. Being in this vulnerable state made me wonder why I had so little control over what I was experiencing, if this was some sort of lucid dream. The conversation between the doctor and the nurses caused me to feel a nauseating level of dread, and I wondered if it was possible to suffer sleep paralysis while in the middle of a dream. I even began to wonder if wearing the headphones to bed might have trapped me in a dream that I couldn't escape. As though the dream was reacting to my anxiety and fear, the beep of the heart rate monitor began speeding up until it caught the attention of the hospital staff. One of the nurses jotted something down on her chart, and after examining me for a moment, they all went back to the work they had been doing. Their reaction to my body's physical response made me wonder if what I was experiencing was even a dream at all. The nurse from my first dream spoke with a hopeful tone as she talked with the other nurses about how my parents and sister had visited me frequently since I was admitted. She said the way my family would stop by daily to talk to me even though I couldn't respond showed a level of determination that she knew I must also have just by being a part of their family. What she seemed most optimistic about was that my sister had the idea to help me come out of the coma by putting on a pair of headphones and playing some of my favorite songs. When she mentioned the headphones, I remembered that I had put on my own pair before going to bed, which made my heart rate increase again. The nurses checked on me again while continuing their conversation, and it sounded like I had just missed my sister. The nurse said she believed that my sister's idea was helping, and that even though it was hard to tell, it seemed like I was responding when my sister would put the headphones on me. Then, just like in the previous dream, I watched one of the other nurses inject something into the IV bag attached to me. The doctor and nurses left the room, and all there was left to observe was the feeling of my fluctuating heart rate and the sounds of the machines. Considering how much longer this dream had been, I wondered whether I was even still dreaming. But as the delirium of whatever the nurse had put in the IV began to work, I found myself lying on my bed in my room, with the headphones slightly pushed off my head. I awoke to the sound of my alarm clock going off. Waking up wasn't such a bad thing, considering the alternative. I pulled myself up and stretched, throwing the covers aside. Unlike after the first dream, my body felt stiff and sore, which I attributed to sleeping too many hours without moving much. Over the next few weeks, I would put the headphones on while doing chores around the house, and I would occasionally wear them to bed. I felt conflicted. The scenario made the dreams seem more like nightmares, but in a weird way, the consistency of the dreams and the voices from the headphones became comforting. Eventually, I didn't feel like I was trapped in a nightmare. Instead, it was like a warm blanket wrapped around me as I drifted off to sleep each night. Then, one day, a few months after I first got the headphones, I had my last dream. I began the routine of settling into bed with the headphones, my head propped up in a way that would keep the headphones from falling off, and the humming of the headphones lulled me to sleep. I woke up in the hospital bed and noticed that seasons had passed since my last dream, even though I had last been in the dream only a day or two earlier. It was winter now, and snow had accumulated on the few cars I could see clearly in the parking lot. As I opened my eyes, I saw that my sister was sitting beside my bed. I tried to speak to her and ask her how long it had been since there was snow outside, but just like in previous dreams, I couldn't. She sat staring at the wall, tears welling up in her eyes. When she finally spoke to me, I could tell from the sound of her voice that she was crying. "It's been months," she said. "I've been trying to get you out of this bed, but nothing seems to be working. It feels like I'm knocking at your door and you're refusing to open it." With every word, I wanted to shout and cry out, but I was helpless. She was silent for what seemed like minutes. She took a deep breath and wiped her tears away, then looked straight into my eyes. I tried to blink, hoping to communicate any way I could, but again, my body wouldn't respond to what my mind was trying to tell it to do. Her gaze shifted to the ceiling, and I could see her lips move. "Isn't enough." Something about the way she said those words made me realize that she was talking to someone else, not me. She continued to stare at the ceiling, and within seconds the doctor came back into the room, kindly asking her to leave. I watched as they spoke, but their voices became distorted and warped. A nurse I didn't recognize had been standing on the other side of the room and consoled my sister with a hug, as though the two were familiar with one another, despite me not recognizing her. After a moment, my sister wiped her face with a tissue she pulled out of her purse, and she walked over to me while the nurse checked all of the medical devices I was still connected to. "Come back soon, okay?" my sister said, her words barely understandable through the humming noise that had begun to fill my head. She leaned in close, kissing me on the cheek, and as she took the headphones off my head, the room faded from the soft white of the hospital to the darkness of the bedroom I had fallen asleep in. It's been months, and I haven't had another dream since then. Despite wearing the headphones to bed every night, I've only had nights of dreamless sleep. Not wanting to miss any opportunity to hear the voices again, I've even made it a habit to wear the headphones out with me when I leave the house. Truthfully, I don't think that I'll ever be able to truly rest until I have the dream again. Since the final time I saw my sister take the headphones off me in the hospital room, being awake feels more dreamlike than when I thought I had been dreaming. It feels like when I'm awake, I'm watching the world around me through a worn-out camera lens filter, and I'm waiting for the day that wearing the headphones makes things feel real again. When I'm awake, the faces of the people around me have begun to seem hollow and vacant. What disturbs me the most is that even my own sister's face seems unfamiliar, like she's not even herself. Every interaction I have with people I've known almost my whole life makes me doubt that anything I experience is real when I'm awake. Even though I can't go anywhere without them now, part of me wishes I had never put the headphones on in the first place. The more I think about it, the less it makes sense. They don't seem to connect to anything, and after months, I still haven't figured out how they work. When I try to recall the details of how this all started, I'm not even sure that I ever actually ordered them, and if I did, how they could be real. After all, how could anyone make headphones that talk to you without so much as a wireless connection? I can live with not knowing how they work, and I know I probably won't ever have the answer. But what continues to haunt me is not knowing why, after all the dreams I had, I was never able to talk back.
Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
Let this post be a record of the hell I've been going through, because I'm not sure I'll be around long enough to tell anyone face to face. What just happened to me was so surreal, and I don't know if my mind is playing tricks on me, or if what I think just happened actually happened. The only reason I'm questioning it is because I haven't been able to sleep for weeks. No matter what I try, melatonin, medications, none of it works. There have been scattered moments where my body can't stay awake and I'll crash, but the moment I realize I'm asleep, I wake up. It's to the point where I feel like I'm outside of myself. Here's some of the background. This problem started one day when I was scrolling through videos on TikTok, when I thought I'd somehow ended up at the end of my feed because I kept seeing the same video every time I tried to scroll down. I didn't think TikTok worked like that, but stranger things have happened. In the video, there were two people in some kind of room. They had their backs turned toward me, so they weren't facing each other, and they seemed to be talking about something. The person who uploaded it didn't give any context, just said, "This is what happened." So I watched it over and over again, trying to figure out what they might have been saying. After watching it several times, I realized that I could hear them clearly, even though they were speaking too softly to understand. And then after a few more times, I realized that I wasn't hearing anything at all. But then, as I continued to watch the video, I began to think that I heard things, sounds from the video. There were noises coming from somewhere else in the room. Then suddenly the sound stopped. I couldn't hear anything anymore. That's when I noticed that the woman in the video had her back turned toward me. She was looking away from me, and when she did this, I saw something move behind her. It was only for a split second, but I saw something moving quickly behind her. It looked like a hand reaching out. I know that sounds crazy, but it's true. I know what I saw. Since then, I haven't been able to get to sleep. Every night I lie in bed thinking about it. What do you think it means? Why would anyone make such a video? Is there really something hiding behind me? Do I need to turn around and look? Will I see whatever it is? How long will I go without sleeping before I finally turn around and see whatever it is? Am I going crazy? Can I ever stop worrying about whether or not I'll see whatever it is? Does it even exist? After watching the video several times, I decided to look for more stories with similar content. I found quite a few, but most of them had nothing to do with the same video I'd seen. I also started to notice how many of the videos were made by girls. Most of the comments on these videos were from other girls too. One thing that surprised me was that all the videos were uploaded from TikTok. None of the videos appeared to be uploaded elsewhere. I went through a few of them to see what kind of videos they were, and some of the videos were uploaded from places like China and Brazil. The majority of the videos were uploaded from TikTok, though. The uploader's account must have been verified because they had a blue check mark next to their name. I searched for more videos with similar content, and I discovered something very disturbing. After I watched the videos, all the accounts that uploaded these videos were deleted. All of their videos were taken off TikTok. I went through some YouTube channels to see if they'd been reposted, but couldn't find anything. I wanted to find out why all of the accounts had been deleted, but I couldn't find anyone talking about it online. I'm afraid I'm losing my mind. At first, I didn't want to tell anyone about this. I didn't know what to think. I feel like maybe I'm being paranoid. I've lost my appetite. I can't seem to focus on anything. I keep feeling like I'm not alone. I feel like I'm being watched. I can't sleep. I keep hearing strange noises. I'm scared. I wish I knew what was happening. I've got to figure out what's going on. I hope I can figure it out soon. I can't take much more of this. When I couldn't find anyone talking about these strange videos online, I started doing some research. Over the past 5 years, there have been a number of reports of missing persons throughout the continental United States. The disappearances are seemingly random in nature, but it seems that the pattern is slowly becoming clearer. If the pattern does indeed hold true, it may indicate that there's a serial killer on the loose. In January 2014, a young man named Mike disappeared near his home in Philadelphia. He was last seen by his girlfriend Rachel walking along West Passyunk Avenue towards South Street. He never returned to the apartment they shared together, nor did he respond to numerous phone calls and text messages. His disappearance was reported to the police after a week had passed when his landlord received an eviction notice from Mike's bank. On February 14th, a young woman named Angela vanished from her home in Houston, Texas. On the day she disappeared, her sister Janice called the police to report that Angela hadn't come home the night before. She said that she'd asked Angela where she was, and Angela told her she was spending the night at a friend's house. Janice said that Angela's car was still parked outside. When Janice woke up in the morning, her bedroom door was closed, but she could hear faint sounds coming from inside the room. When she opened the door, she saw a pair of footprints leading from the doorway into the hallway. There were no signs of forced entry, so she assumed that Angela had left of her own accord. On April 11th, another young woman named Rebecca went missing from Phoenix, Arizona. After she failed to return home from work, her parents filed a missing persons report. It wasn't until May that they realized that the last time they spoke to her, she told them that she might have to quit her job if she didn't get enough hours. They contacted the company she worked for, but no one had seen her since March 8th. The one thing in common with these disappearances, and several others I read about, was that all of the victims had recently watched a disturbing video. Each story had a quote from a friend or family member saying that their loved one who disappeared had been acting strange after watching a video online. I kept searching TikTok for videos that matched the description of the ones I'd seen, but I couldn't find any. I tried looking for videos that were uploaded from TikTok, but again, I couldn't find anything. I even looked for videos that had been posted on YouTube over the past 4 years and couldn't find anything either. I don't know what to make of it all, but something was definitely wrong. Something horrible was happening and I needed to know what. Then one day something changed. I logged onto TikTok and found nothing but the video I'd seen before. It was almost exactly as I remembered it, except for one detail. Instead of the woman I saw in the first video, there was a man who looked eerily like me. I stared at the screen in disbelief. I had no idea how long I'd been watching the exact same video. I deleted the app immediately. It's been at least 10 days since I deleted the TikTok app from my phone, but today the same video appeared in my suggested videos on YouTube. But this time it looked different. The man in the video still looked like me at first, but the angle of the video was much closer this time, and I knew this person didn't just look like me. He was me. Small details I hadn't noticed before stood out now, and the room I was in the video was definitely the living room in my apartment. How could someone get into my house and film me without realizing it? Was this person following me everywhere I went? What was going on? I thought of the old man who lived across the hall from me. He's always watched me with such a creepy stare from his window. Maybe he's connected somehow, but why would he do something like this? He's harmless. I decided to go talk to him, but when I got back from the store where I bought some ice cream, he was already gone. I checked his apartment, but I couldn't find him anywhere. My curiosity was getting the best of me, so I drove around the neighborhood looking for him, but I couldn't find him anywhere. I didn't want to lose him again. So I turned off my car and sat in the parking lot next to my neighbor's building. If he was watching me, he wouldn't be able to turn away from the streetlight that illuminated my car. I waited patiently, listening to the hum of traffic passing through the intersection nearby. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps approaching from behind me. I turned around and gasped. My neighbor was standing right beside my car with a large smile on his face. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "Did you need something?" "What are you doing here?" I asked suspiciously. "Nothing," he replied. "Just wanted to say hello." He chuckled and continued to walk towards me. I opened my mouth to tell him to leave, but then an image of the YouTube video flashed through my mind. Before I could speak, he grabbed my hand and placed it on his cheek. I let out a startled squeal. "It's okay," he said. "You're safe now." Nothing can hurt you anymore. For a moment, I felt relieved. Then I remembered what I'd seen in the video. It wasn't real. I couldn't believe it. A chill ran down my spine, and I pulled my hands away from him. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. "You're scaring me. Let go of me." My neighbor smiled at me. His teeth were yellow and crooked. I didn't have enough time to think before he threw his arms around me. The feeling of his rough skin against mine sent shivers up my spine. I struggled to push him away, but he clung tightly to me. With every ounce of strength I had, I pushed him away. I managed to shove him aside, and he stumbled backwards, tripping over his own feet and falling to the ground. He lay there motionless, and I suddenly realized that he wasn't wearing shoes. I had never seen him without them before. A bright light flashed in front of me. I shielded my eyes from the glare and saw the figure of a tall man standing in the doorway of another neighbor's apartment. The neighbor shouted to us from the doorway, "Is everything all right out there?" The old man got up and walked toward his apartment. While he stumbled a bit and walked toward his apartment, I could hear him say, "Everything's fine. I just took a tumble when this nice young man came to help me." He unlocked the door to his apartment and walked in, locking it behind him. Adrenaline was rushing through me, and I didn't know whether to follow behind or run as far away as I could. In my sleep-deprived state, I decided to go into my apartment, locking and deadbolting the door. I turned on every light in the apartment and grabbed my laptop. That's when I started writing this post. Just a moment ago, a new tab opened in my browser. I knew I shouldn't click it, but I did. This time, it's a live YouTube video titled, "I Found Him Again." Almost everything from the last video is the same, except in this video I'm clearly looking at my laptop screen and typing. The video has that sort of weird infinite video effect that happens when a live video captures a video of itself. Now I know why no one else had uploaded any other videos of the figure. They all experienced the same thing that I did. My heart is racing. I feel flushed and dizzy. I can feel him staring at me right now. I don't know how long I've been typing this, but I'm sure whatever I'm writing will disappear soon. I can see the outline of a big black figure standing beside my couch. I can see a hand slowly coming into frame behind me. I can't take it anymore. I won't be able to defend myself or kick out the old man if I don't turn around. I may be sleep deprived, but I'm in my prime and he has to be at least in his 70s. I'll continue from here after I...
Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
I think something is wrong with the barista at my local coffee shop. I've been going in there a lot lately, because it's just around the corner from where we live and they have really good coffee. And while she always gives me decent service, for some reason, her eyes seem to be following me everywhere. It's a little creepy. When I go in the morning before work, I can see that she's watching me as soon as I walk through the door, and when I sit down at one of the tables by the window, she'll keep glancing over at me, but then quickly look away whenever I catch her eye. Later on in the day, when I come back home from work, she'll still be here behind the counter making coffees for people, and again, she'll keep looking at me, but this time without any pretense about trying not to stare. She won't even try to pretend like she's paying attention to what someone else is saying, rather than fixating on whatever it is they're doing. No, she's definitely staring at me. My wife Lisa also says she sees her looking out the front windows all the time. She watches our car drive up, and she'll stand there waiting for us until we get inside before she goes back to work. But if you ask me, she seems more interested in what I'm doing than who I am. While I'm in there getting my coffee, which I love, by the way, she stares right at me, studying my face, watching every move I make. At least once a week, I'll leave the place shaking my head and thinking about what it must be like for other customers. What do they think she's seeing? That I'm some kind of freak or something? Maybe she knows me from somewhere, but I don't know how. The last time I was in the coffee shop, she did something particularly strange. She kept staring at me, but instead of being a little nervous and fidgeting with her hands or tugging at her hair or doing anything she normally does when I'm there, she started putting stuff into my bag. First, she'd put a spoon in, and then she'd take it out, but after that she'd shove another item in and then pull it out again. This went on for about a minute, so I finally asked her what she was doing. She looked surprised, but she didn't stop. Instead, she stood there smiling at me, waiting for me to notice what she was doing. So I took the bag from her hands, opened it up, and dumped everything out onto the table. The random coffee shop junk and plastic cutlery was weird enough, but even more strange was a neatly folded photo of herself that sat on top of the pile. In the picture, she was looking straight at the camera, holding her arms out wide. Her smile was big and bright, and she had a sparkle in her eyes like she was proud of something. There were two guys standing next to her, both dressed in black jackets and jeans. They seemed to be having an argument with her, but she wasn't trying to defend herself. She just smiled like she was happy to be wherever she was. "What is this?" I said, picking up the photograph. She told me it belonged to me, then she walked off, leaving me alone with my coffee and the other customers watching me curiously. The whole thing was bizarre. I mean, who would give their own photo away to someone they barely know? Still, it didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt like she was giving it to me because she wanted to, which made me wonder why she was so obsessed with me. The whole situation made me feel nervous and queasy, so I packed up all of my things I had dumped out of the bag and went home. I called my wife on the way home and told her what had happened. "It's probably just something stupid," she said, but I knew it wasn't. When I got home, I turned on the TV and tried to forget about it. After about half an hour, though, I couldn't help myself. I had to know what was going on. Even if it was nothing, I needed to find out. So I grabbed my laptop and started searching for clues. I know the names of some of the more extroverted baristas at the coffee shop, so I looked them up on Facebook. After scrolling through multiple friends lists to see if I could find the girl who put the photo in my bag, I finally found her. Her name is Emily Prentice, and she lives on the east side of town, not far from where I live, actually. With a little digging, I also discovered that she has 3 brothers, 2 older ones and another younger one who looks exactly like her. All of them have dark hair and blue eyes and are around the same height as Emily. I recognized 2 of the boys as being the ones in the photo. Her post history was what caught me off guard. A few months ago, she made a post about one of her brothers named Nathan, who was in a serious car accident, rushed to the hospital, but sadly passed away. Some of her posts memorialized him as she recounted the fun things they used to do together, like going camping and skiing. I've known people with siblings who have died before, but I still can't imagine how painful it must be to lose any family member. Nearly every day for a month, she would post about how she wished he would come back. Then, one day, the posts took an ominous turn. She started regularly posting about how she was going to get Nathan back. Some of her friends commented and expressed concerns about how she was coping, but she just ignored them. Eventually, she started posting about how she saw Nathan and how good it was to see him again. That was followed by regular updates of how she would see Nathan at work, but that she was too busy to talk much when she was working. As the days progressed, the posts became less frequent until eventually they stopped altogether. I finished my search and closed the laptop feeling conflicted. On one hand, I thought this was a weird coincidence that made absolutely no sense. We're not close. She's just a stranger who works at a coffee shop. But on the other hand, I couldn't shake the feelings of unease I'd been experiencing since she first appeared. I honestly couldn't think of a time I had ever seen her anywhere else besides the coffee shop. My mind kept racing, so I decided to go for a walk instead of sitting at home and thinking. I kissed Lisa on the cheek, put on my shoes, grabbed my keys, and left. It was getting dark, and the street lamps were buzzing to life. I felt sad for Emily because the way she was coping didn't seem healthy. At the same time, I felt nervous and uneasy about the bizarre interaction we had when she gave me the photo. I continued walking under the street lamps and began to sense that I might not be alone, but figured I was just paranoid. Cicada songs gradually quieted, at which point I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around and sure enough, Emily was right behind me, trying to catch up to me. She had that same smile I remembered from the photo, and I could hear her laughing between her deep breaths as she started running toward me. The thought of this stalker chasing me in the dark pushed my body into fight or flight mode, so I began running. I ran in the first direction I thought would get me home the quickest, and the sudden turn caught Emily off guard. She threw her arms up in the air in frustration, but smiled and laughed, picking up her pace as she began chasing after me. I sped up and ran as fast as I could, terrified at the sound of her laughing in the dark. I looked behind me, and she had stopped to catch her breath, bent over with her hands on her knees, huffing and puffing. As I continued running, I looked back and saw she had her hand in the air, as she shouted that she was glad to see me again. At this point, I felt tired, but safe enough to slow to a jog. What was wrong with this girl? I couldn't stick around and find out. I rounded the last street corner to get to my house, made a final dash to the door, unlocked it, opened it, and slammed it shut after I got inside. I locked the door and checked the peephole, but I couldn't see Emily. I stopped to catch my breath, but my head was practically spinning from the adrenaline rush. I went into the kitchen and grabbed a hand towel to wipe away the sweat that was pouring down my face. My heart was still racing, and I was still breathing heavily. I heard Lisa walking downstairs, and I tried to calm myself down so that I wouldn't worry her. Apparently, I hadn't tried hard enough because I could see the concern on her face before she even said anything to me. "Oh, I just got back from a walk. You know, the weirdest thing just happened," I said before Lisa interrupted me. "Look at you," she said. "You're drenched in sweat. You look like you just took a swim in your clothes." She took my hands into hers, noticing they were still shaking. She pulled me close, realizing something was wrong, and looked up at me. Her eyes were wide but sincerely concerned as she looked into mine and asked, "Did something happen while you were on your walk, Nathan?"
Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
My dad always loved the Beatles. He knew all of their songs by heart, and I swear, at a moment's notice, he was ready to drop more information about the Beatles than you could find on their Wikipedia page. He even named me Jude, and some of my earliest memories are of him belting out "Hey Jude" to me. His collection of their whole discography on vinyl was his prized possession, the most prized of which was the White Album. He was practically an evangelist for that one. He always said that the White Album was the culmination of everything good about the Beatles, and it had something for everyone. I can remember all the times he would sit back, relax, and listen to the whole double album. By the time one of the final tracks on the album, Revolution 9, came on, he was practically entranced. He said the album really spoke to him. I mention all this because my dad passed about a month ago. We had a great relationship, so it really shook me up. Since then, I've been going through the record collection he left for me and started reminiscing over how much he loved the Beatles. One day last week, when I was looking through them, I found the White Album. It had been years since I'd listened to it, so I listened to it in his memory. The whole thing was great, but I've always had a weird feeling when I listened to Revolution 9. And I mean real weird. All the noise and the random talking just gives me the creeps. I usually skip that one, but felt like I owed it to his memory to listen from beginning to end. The thing is, though, that this time around, the feeling I got wasn't creeped out. It was almost a feeling like butterflies in my stomach. So I listened through to the end. That was when it happened. I don't know if anyone else has ever experienced this, but it was as if the music somehow took on a life of its own. I don't understand what happened or why it did, but that night, I fell asleep with the record playing softly in the background. When I woke up the next morning, I had this strange sense that I had done something wrong, like I had forgotten something important. That morning, I put the White Album on again while going through Dad's things. I knew all the songs from my childhood, but they were starting to grow on me personally, in a way they never did before. I could feel myself getting drawn into the music. I hadn't realized that I was dancing along with the music until I actually looked down and saw my feet moving without any help from me. There was a small part of me that wondered why I was doing this. I sat down to look through the liner notes of the album and came across a handwritten note. It didn't look like Dad's handwriting, so I was curious to find out why it was in the album sleeve. The note said, "You have to hear Revolution 9. I placed the note back into the sleeve, assuming it was a note from a previous owner before my dad. I continued going through my dad's things and listening to the album. Eventually, I got to the end of Cry Baby Cry, and Revolution 9 began. For the first time listening to it, it sounded like nothing I had ever heard before. I mean that literally. I was hearing things I had never heard in the song before. It was almost as if I could feel the song moving around me. The song went on for a long time, and I didn't really pay attention to what was going on in the background. Then at one point I realized that the noise coming from the track was gone, and I realized that there was a voice coming from the other side of the record. I stopped the record and listened carefully. I couldn't believe my ears. The voice sounded like Dad's. He was saying something, but I couldn't make out what he was saying, so I moved the needle and played it again. This time, I made sure to listen closely. I still couldn't make out what he was saying, but I could tell that he was trying to talk to me. I started to get worried when I realized that I wasn't going to be able to understand him. I kept playing the song over and over again, waiting for him to say something more, but it was just the same thing over and over. I decided to keep going with the song. The longer I listened to it, the more I felt like I was losing control of my body. My head started to hurt, and I found myself struggling to breathe. I don't know how long I was like that, but eventually I fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning, I had the strangest feeling. It was as if I was back in the living room, where I had been dancing along with the music. I looked down at my feet and saw that they were moving again. I looked around the room and everything was the same. I couldn't believe what was happening. I started to panic. I thought I was going crazy. I called my sister Hannah and asked her if she had ever noticed anything weird about the album when Dad would put it on. She told me that she never noticed anything strange. She said that Dad liked to play it sometimes when we were kids, but that was all. I asked her if she remembered anything about how Dad would get listening to the White Album, and she told me that he used to get into this really deep trance when he listened to it. She said that he would sit there and stare at the record player for hours, like he was mesmerized by it. She seemed a little concerned why I would be asking about this, and I told her I was just reminiscing and had listened to the album the night before. We talked a few more minutes before I told her I needed to get back to sorting through Dad's things. I couldn't stop myself from going back to the album. I pulled the record out of the sleeve and set it on Dad's old record player. I decided this time I would go straight to Revolution 9. The butterflies feeling returned, and it felt like a cool breeze passed me. It nearly gave me goosebumps. I didn't know what to expect, but I wanted to see if the voice would speak to me again. The record spun, and I waited for the song to start. Once again, the song went on for a long time. As it neared the end, I realized that the noise from the track was gone, and then I heard the voice again. This time I could make out what he was saying. Listen to the song. Listen to the song. Listen to the song. I got up and walked around the room trying to find the source of the voice. I started to feel dizzy and confused. I sat down and tried to figure out what was happening. All I could do was stare at the spinning record and listen. The voice became clearer, but it didn't sound like Dad. If I hadn't been so entranced, I would have fallen out of my chair when I heard the voice say, You must hear the song. You must hear the song. You must hear the song. There was nothing I could do but sit in the chair and stare at the spinning record. I felt chills run down my side, through my legs and into my toes. I felt a grin growing on my face until my cheeks hurt. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Someone or something was speaking to me. The voice hadn't stopped talking to me until I realized that the album had almost come to an end. As the final track, Good Night, was ending, I continued staring at the spinning record. I felt like the record player was pulling me toward it. I knew in that moment that the voices on the record had changed. I heard the usual whispered, "Good night, everybody. Everybody. Everywhere." And time seemed to stop for me when it followed up with, "Good night, Jude." Adrenaline rushed through my body as I regained control over it and the record stopped spinning. I felt flushed, and cold sweat dripped down my forehead. My cheeks felt relief as I was able to finally release the grin that had grown on my face moments earlier. I placed the record carefully back into the sleeve and took greater care handling it than I ever had before. I knew Dad's record collection needed to be treasured. For the first time, I finally felt what Dad had told me all these years. This album really speaks to me.
Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
I never went camping much as a kid, so when one of my work buddies, Sam, invited me on a camping trip he planned with his cousin Matthew, I was excited to do it again as an adult. Sam and I had become pretty good friends at work, so I thought it would be a great opportunity to hang out for a weekend. He and Matthew spend a lot of time outdoors, and one of their favorite camping spots is on the beach near an old lighthouse. I don't usually meet my friends' family, so I took this opportunity to be more outgoing and try to make a new friend in the process. He told me they camp on the beach at Jubilee Cove every year, so I had high expectations by the time the first day of the trip came around. Sam asked that I bring my own tent and sleeping bag and said I could ride with him to the beach, while Matthew would meet up with us later that day since he was driving separately after he got off an early shift at work. The drive to Jubilee Cove took us about 70 miles northeast, and we got there in the late afternoon. When we arrived, I was glad to see that the beach wasn't crowded like the beaches that I'm used to visiting, so I would have a decent opportunity to really relax. We set up our tents on the beach, being sure not to set up too close to the shoreline. After setting up, we ate a couple of the sandwiches we packed in a cooler and sat back, enjoying the sound of the crashing waves and seagulls looking for the perfect chance to swoop in for a bit of food. Off in the distance, I saw the lighthouse overlooking the area. I figured it must have been ages since someone had been inside it based on the visibly cracked windows and the exterior missing pieces of stone here and there. Despite the lighthouse seeming abandoned, I thought I saw movement toward the top of the inside of the lighthouse. But I figured I must have been imagining things when I saw a seagull fly away from the same area outside the lighthouse. I remembered that we were still waiting on Matthew after settling in for about an hour, so I asked Sam if everything was all right with Matthew. He had been texting Matthew while we were eating and said he had run into some issues with his truck, but that he should meet us at the beach soon. We sat around talking and waiting for Matthew at the campsite for another hour or so, watched the sunset, and decided we should probably settle in for the night a little after it got dark. Between our tents, we had started a fire in a fire pit, and we decided to keep it burning in case Matthew arrived while we were still awake. We left a large gap between our tents so that Matthew could set up his own between them once he arrived, and Sam said he would keep his eye on the campfire while he waited up a bit longer. Since he was on campfire duty, I took the opportunity to head to my tent, change my clothes, and relax before our full day camping at the beach the next morning. I don't remember falling asleep, but woke up suddenly with the feeling someone was watching me. There was nothing I could see through the dark, but felt like I saw something move behind my tent. At first, I panicked, thinking maybe there was some sort of animal nearby, but soon realized Matthew might have finally arrived. I waited and listened to hear if any of the noises would continue, but they had stopped after I woke up. No matter though, I was wide awake now. I unzipped the tent flap and looked outside. Nothing. The sky was still mostly black, but I could tell it had grown somewhat lighter since we went to bed. I switched my flashlight on and looked around again, trying to figure out where I might have seen movement. Then I heard the sound of footsteps approaching in the sand. I swung my head around to look, but there was nothing. I listened for more sounds, and the sound of the footsteps continued. I turned my light back toward the path leading to our tents. Someone with a flashlight was walking down the path slowly, as if lost or searching for something. I watched him approach, and as he drew closer, I saw a man who looked about Sam's height, but with dark hair, unlike Sam's dirty blonde hair. His face lit up when he saw mine, and he waved excitedly. He then walked over to the fire pit and picked up a stick. He threw it into the fire, leaving the glowing embers burning brightly. "Hey, sorry to get here so late. Car trouble. I'm Matthew." He reached his right hand out for a handshake, his left hand pointing the flashlight uncomfortably toward my face. "Oh, hey, I began before he cut me off when he realized he was shining the flashlight right at my eyes. "Sorry, I didn't mean to blind you." "No worries," I replied. I awkwardly shook his hand as he lowered the flashlight, not realizing that I forgot to finish introducing myself. "How was the drive over here? You're a braver man than me driving out here in the middle of the night," I said. "Oh, not too bad. I've been down here tons of times. I could practically drive here in the dark." He set down a backpack that had been slung over his right shoulder, and I noticed a cut on the back of his left hand. It seemed like it was probably somewhat fresh when his flashlight illuminated it while switching from one hand to the other. "That looks like it hurts. Do you have anything to cover that up? I can check my bag if you need a bandage or something," I said. "Oh, no, this just happened while I was dealing with the car issue that made me so late. I've tinkered with cars before, but I'm no expert, as you can probably guess by how late it is." Matthew approached the fire pit between my tent and Sam's, bent down next to me, and whispered, "Look." I followed his gaze towards the rising smoke. In the distance, I could see a light, growing brighter as Matthew pointed it out. I hadn't noticed it before, but there was a faint light coming from inside the lighthouse. Matthew lifted his finger to his lips and moved his eyes to look in different directions. He motioned to follow him. I nodded and followed cautiously. Matthew led me through a path right off the beach toward the lighthouse, flashlight in hand. We approached the lighthouse, and seeing it up close only exacerbated how ancient it looked after being abandoned. We walked inside and saw a rickety staircase, which Matthew climbed first. I followed after, reaching the top and looking back down the way we came. From this height, the lighthouse stood tall and powerful, as if protecting the small town it belonged to. Matthew looked out one of the windows and sat on the inner ledge below it. "What are you doing?" I asked. Matthew put his hands behind his head and leaned back, stretching out. "This is the best view I've ever seen," he said, smiling. "You sure this isn't dangerous? You know, you could fall or get trapped in here. You never know what could happen." "There's nothing to worry about, man. This place is perfectly safe. Come here, have a seat. I'll show you." I climbed up to join Matthew, being careful not to slip off the edge. We sat there silently for several minutes, enjoying the breeze coming through cracks in the windows. After a while, Matthew turned to me and looked at me intently, almost quizzically. "Have you ever wondered what happened to your family? How they disappeared, I guess I should say. Your father told me. He tells me everything about the accident. Of course, I didn't believe him at first, but now I do. It makes sense. Why shouldn't it make sense? I don't understand how anyone could think otherwise." I looked at him with an obvious look of disbelief. After all, this comment came out of nowhere, and as far as I knew, my family was completely fine. I sat dumbfounded, unable to respond before he added nervously, Well, I thought about asking you on our way up here, but I figured it would be weird to bring up such a heavy topic while we were just getting to know one another. I always feel awkward when I ask questions like that. Matthew, I replied. I don't know where any of this is coming from. My family is fine. What are you talking about? Oh, come on, what do you think? I can see it in your face. Everyone wants to talk about their family history, especially when they're away from home. I bet you guys used to spend hours telling stories about each other. You're starting to freak me out, I replied, trying to figure out the distance between us so that I could calculate my chances of being able to escape if this conversation became any more unusual or morbid. We stared at one another for a moment, both unsure of what to say. Matthew broke the silence by saying, Hey, I was wondering, do you mind if I sleep here tonight? Knock yourself out, man, I replied, thankful that he might sleep anywhere other than near my tent. I sat for a moment trying to understand what he was getting at, but was relieved that he seemed to have dropped the topic of my family. Why do you want to sleep up here anyway? Isn't it dangerous? It's supposed to be. That's why it makes a great lookout, and besides, there will only be 2 of us. I began to nod, but stopped myself. 2 of us? I asked. Yeah, just me and you, buddy. There won't be anyone else up here since everyone else is asleep. That's part of the fun of camping, right? What do you mean by everyone else? Sam is the only other person camping with us, and he's down at the campsite. Yeah, that's what I meant. Do you mind if I tell you something he told me? Something he probably wouldn't want you to hear? Just promise not to repeat anything. He paused, looking intently into my eyes. For a moment, I thought he might be going to ask me another question, but instead, he continued. Sam said that you know exactly what this place is. You know the significance of this location. You know better than anybody. But you also know that Sam is scared of it. And you don't care, because you're not afraid anymore. I was so stunned by the overconfidence in his voice that I couldn't reply. You see, this place is special because it holds the secret to your family's disappearance. The reason you're here. It's a very strange story, isn't it? Not too many people get to go back to their childhood home as adults and discover the truth behind this sort of thing. Matthew, I interrupted. I have no idea what you're talking about. First, you said it was an accident, and then you said this lighthouse has something to do with it. You've got to realize nothing about what you're saying makes sense. It makes perfect sense to me. I was telling you the truth earlier. When Sam told me about this camping trip, I started to wonder if the place really held some kind of meaning for your family. Then I realized that the lighthouse is almost directly over the spot where the accident happened. So I looked it up online and found that you did live nearby, at least until you were 6 years old. By this point, I had come up with 3 or 4 ways I could get out of this situation. So I tried to pick the one that would make it less likely for him to follow me or realize I was trying to escape. Well, my family is fine. I've never even visited this beach before, so Sam must have had me mixed up with someone else. I paused, initiating my exit plan. Hey, Matt, I'm gonna head back to the campsite to grab something to make myself comfortable up here. Do you need anything while I'm down there? No, I've got everything I need up here. Don't you? As I began walking down the staircase, the awkward silence felt threatening. I turned and saw him staring straight at me with his brow furrowed, and I swear I could have felt his gaze pierce right through me. It's Matthew, not Matt. It felt like a lump had hardened in my throat, leaving it with a dryness that made it hard to speak. Sorry, man. I'll be right back, I said, beginning to make my way down the staircase. Hey, wait, I didn't say anything wrong, did I? It was my mistake. I wasn't thinking. Please, I don't want you to leave. You can stay here. It's cool with me. I'm not going anywhere. I continued to walk down the stairs, taking each step carefully. He followed closely behind me, making sure not to let me get too far ahead. I don't think I can risk staying here tonight after all. You're right. This is just too dangerous, he said, following close behind and crashing each of my exit plans. I tried to come up with something to say to keep him in the lighthouse and thought it would help if I said something validating about what I had rejected as too dangerous just moments earlier. I should probably go now, I said. I mean, I've got to get back to the campsite and get ready for tomorrow. If you'd rather not come, I understand. The view is great up here. I continued walking down the staircase, hoping that he would stop and stay behind, but he continued following me down. What are you doing? You can't leave me here alone. This place isn't safe. I know it. There's something very strange about this whole thing. I'm serious. Something very bad could happen to me, he said. About halfway down the staircase, I looked behind me and saw Matthew hop onto another ledge with one of the visibly cracked windows, and assumed he reconsidered following me. But what happened next made me double take. Matthew punched a hole through the window and stuck his head out, looking left and right, pulling his head back inside the lighthouse. He looked back at me, chuckling and playfully grinning, as though he hadn't just destroyed part of this lighthouse. "Race you down? See ya," he said, propelling himself through the broken window that must have been at least 100 feet off the ground. In an instant, he disappeared from view. I took a deep breath, quickly made my way down the rest of the staircase, and began to run toward the beach where I hoped to find help. But as I rounded the corner of the lighthouse, a hand shot out and grabbed me around the shoulder. "Wait up, let me take you back to the campsite. I'm sure they're worried sick about you. Why are you running?" Matthew ran to the edge of a nearby dock and stopped, pointing to the top of the lighthouse tower. "Let me show you something really cool. Come up here and bring your phone. There are some great views up here." "I'm good. You go without me," I replied. "I wasn't asking," said Matthew, approaching me menacingly from the end of the dock. I knew I had to do something, so I turned and ran toward the campground, torn between wanting to hide from him and wanting to cry out for Sam to help me. It was still dark outside, but I could tell that the darkness would soon come to an end, and if I was going to hide, I needed to be as far away from him as I could before sunrise. I made a sudden 90-degree turn away from the campsite to look for a spot where Matthew wouldn't see me. I had only gone about 50 yards when he called out, "Hey, wait! Where are you going?" I kept quiet, continuing to head away from the campground, hoping I might find something left behind by other beachgoers that I could use to cover myself. I had no idea whether he saw me or not, and I did my best to keep my stride steady. "Where are you going? Come back here!" he shouted again, coming closer with each call. His voice seemed to echo throughout the area, causing me to slow my pace even more to avoid being heard. I turned around to walk backwards so I could keep my eyes on Matthew, if I could see him at all, while looking for any shelter I could find. This probably wasn't the best idea, as I had found myself on the sand dunes, and every step I took was on ground even more uneven than the last. Despite my attempts to keep track of Matthew, I lost him when I looked down to help prevent myself from falling, and after only a few seconds, I also failed that attempt too. I suddenly fell on my back, wondering if Matthew had somehow eluded me and grabbed me, and when I looked up, I realized I had fallen down the side of a sand dune near a few large patches of tall beach grass. I pushed myself up and knelt next to one of the patches of beach grass and surveyed my surroundings. Off in the distance, I could see the flickering fire of the fire pit, and the glow of the fire provided enough light for me to see Matthew, who was walking toward the campsite as quickly as he could through the thick sand. Not wanting to make my location known, I kept my mouth shut and tried to slow my breathing. I began to fear for Sam, but tried calming myself down, remembering people often get used to the odd things their family members do. I had brought my phone with me and thought about calling Sam, but didn't want Matthew to know I was calling, so I chose to wait and hope that Matthew's behavior was either an elaborate joke or something that wouldn't put Sam at risk. I did a quick check of what I had on me and realized all I had other than my phone was what I was wearing, now soaked with sweat. From a distance, I watched Matthew approach the fire pit, grab his bag, and throw it over his shoulder, and saw that he seemed to be trying to cover and soothe the wound on his hand that I noticed when I first met him. He turned off his flashlight and slowly approached Sam's tent. He seemed to inspect the tent for any nets or flaps he could peer into, but after a few moments, he slowly backed away from Sam's tent, maybe about 10 to 15 feet, before sprinting through the thick sand, away from the campsite, and more importantly, in that moment, away from me. I decided to lie low until I saw daylight, and when I was confident that Matthew still wasn't around, I would meet Sam at the campsite. I found myself nestled up against a slight depression in the sand, and the stress of running away quickly manifested itself as exhaustion. I did my best not to fall asleep, but I reasoned that the beach grass and the curves and depressions of the sand dunes might shield me until sunrise, and I gradually allowed myself to fall asleep, listening to the waves crashing on the shore. I slept for at least 2 or 3 hours, and as the darkness shifted into morning light, I was awakened by the cries of seagulls and the voices of beachgoers who arrived early enough to see the sunrise over the water. I thought I might have heard the sound of heavy footsteps in the sand nearby, but was relieved to see 2 men walking with their fishing equipment toward the dock near the lighthouse. I laid my head back down and felt relieved, knowing that there were people around other than Sam and Matthew. Over the next half hour, as I was waking up and replaying the previous night's events in my mind, I watched as families approached the beach with their bags and folding chairs. I stood up and began walking toward the campsite, my legs sore from running through the sand. When I arrived, I found Sam sitting in a folding chair, one leg propped up on the other, scrolling through his phone and drinking coffee from a travel mug. "Early morning, huh?" he asked. "Yeah, I guess you could say that," I replied. "It looks like you went out for a run. It's awesome going out this early on the beach, right?" I looked around to see if Matthew was with Sam, but I couldn't see anyone around other than the people who had set up their chairs a few hundred yards away from us. "Hey, have you seen Matthew?" I asked. Sam looked confused and replied, "No, why do you ask?" I looked around for any sign of the belongings he had been carrying when I first saw him, but there was nothing around other than what Sam and I brought. "Anyway, man, you don't have to call him Matthew. Just call him Matt when you meet him. Everyone else does." "He didn't say he stopped by the campsite last night?" I asked. Sam looked puzzled again and began scanning the area around us. "No, he sent me a text saying he would be here this morning. He was working on his truck when this weird guy came up and started talking to him. They ended up talking about how he was going to the beach, and the guy completely flipped out on Matt. They ended up getting into a fight, and right when he was about to call the police, this weirdo just ran off. He decided to just call it a day and pick up again this morning." As he was talking, I slowly lost focus of what he was saying while my mind raced, wondering who it was that took me up to the lighthouse the night before. If this was some cruel joke between cousins, it didn't seem funny to me. As I came back to my senses, I realized Sam was staring at me, and that I had completely zoned out while I was trying to piece together what had happened. Just then, I heard the sound of a truck's engine approaching the beach and saw Sam quickly turn around, approach the truck, and ask me to come with him. He caught up with the truck, spoke to the driver, and pointed toward the campsite. The driver's hair was a dark shade of blonde, and he had a short beard similar to Sam's. He raised a hand to greet me from behind the steering wheel, and I responded in kind. I turned away and walked toward my tent to check on the things I had brought with me since I had slept out in the dunes, but nothing seemed out of place. Nevertheless, in that moment, I couldn't wait to come up with an excuse to go back home early. And I knew I would need to be more tactful than when I tried to get out of the lighthouse alone the night before. As I walked out of the tent, I properly met the driver of the truck, who is now bringing camping equipment out of his truck bed onto the campsite. He introduced himself as Matthew, but said I could call him Matt. Unlike the person I had met the night before, Matt shared the same sociable demeanor as Sam, and seemed to be put off by my hesitance to say much after he arrived. I excused myself to rest, since Sam was already under the impression that I had just come back from a morning run, and sat in one of the folding chairs around the previously smoldering fire pit. As I looked off in the distance toward the lighthouse, I saw the previously cracked window was now completely shattered, just as I had witnessed happening the night before. I looked beyond the lighthouse toward the shimmering blue horizon and noticed sailboats not too far away. The sound of the crashing waves was punctuated by seagull calls, and I felt myself begin to relax and melt into the environment around me. I had fallen asleep once again, this time in the safety of the campsite surrounded by at least one familiar face, but was jostled awake when Sam put his hand on my left shoulder and gently shook it. I opened my eyes and noticed a small crowd gathering around the base of the lighthouse, pointing up toward the shattered window, seeming to have a lively discussion about what happened to the lighthouse. I stood up to give Sam my full attention. A man and a woman were walking away from us toward the crowd at the lighthouse after speaking with Sam and Matt, and I realized the previous night's events were now the focus of everyone gathered nearby on the beach. Sam looked at me and back up to the lighthouse, focusing on the broken window while shielding his eyes from the sun, and said, "I talked to some of the people down there by the lighthouse. One of the girls camping nearby said she heard a window shattering in the middle of the night and could have sworn she saw someone being chased before both of the guys disappeared. You didn't hear anything, did you?"
Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
I've had a terrible habit since I was a kid. My mom always warned me not to, but I've always gotten this odd feeling of satisfaction when I rub my eyes. You know how when you rub your eyes just long enough, you can start seeing those bright, colorful patterns that shift and spin like fireworks? Something about it has always felt so good. I distinctly remember visiting the optometrist when I was growing up and being warned not to rub my eyes like that because I would damage them. At the time, I thought she must be exaggerating, but now I realize she wasn't. Not only have I done exactly what I was told not to do for years on end, but it's become somewhat of a secret guilty pleasure of mine. One of the problems with rubbing your eyes is that it can damage your cornea. It's something that I never really gave much thought to until recently. A few months ago, when I woke up one morning and my vision seemed blurrier than it usually is, I made an appointment with my optometrist to make sure that everything was fine. She examined my eyes and found nothing wrong, but I still had this sense that things weren't right. Even though I knew my bad habit could have been contributing to my worsening vision, I just kept on doing it. But eventually, I started noticing something new. As I rubbed my eyes, I began to notice that there were strange distortions around me. At first, I assumed I was imagining things, but then I tried closing my eyes and keeping my hands at my sides, and I noticed that the same thing happened. The world outside of my closed eyelids seemed warped somehow. When I opened my eyes, things seemed that way too. It was sort of like when you stare at a light a little too long, and the shape of the light is burned into your vision for a few seconds. Eventually, when I would rub my eyes, I started to see flashes of color as well. The colors were similar to the patterns I saw in my peripheral vision when I rubbed my eyes, except these didn't fade away after a short period of time. Instead, they stayed with me for hours, sometimes days at a time. It seemed odd because I had never seen colors like these before with my eyes closed. I made a follow-up appointment because I could tell things were getting worse, and I didn't want to wake up one morning not being able to see at all. When I mentioned this to my optometrist, she said that she had never heard any other patients mention the same problem, but because there was nothing visibly wrong with my eyes, she told me to just stop rubbing them and not stress too much about it. Time went by and I continued with my bad habit. I knew it wasn't right, but I had to keep doing it. In addition to the new colors I had started to see, I would see small fragments of images flickering across my eyesight from time to time. They appeared to move quickly and erratically, and each fragment lasted only a second or two, but I could tell they were moving very fast. The images almost looked like video snippets of someone else watching TV. Every once in a while, I would also see these strange fragments of colored light when I looked directly at something. There was nothing immediately apparent to distinguish their source, but they always appeared to be coming from somewhere near the ceiling. The way they moved was almost like how a small animal moves when it runs from one place to another when it's trying to avoid being seen. But unlike other animals, these flashes of light had no discernible pattern. They seem to appear out of nowhere and disappear again just as quickly. Over the past few weeks, these occurrences have become more frequent and intense. Now I can see these objects in flashes of color pretty regularly. I'm starting to think that I've gone completely insane. It's like some kind of horrible mutation has started to take hold inside my brain. It doesn't matter if I close my eyes or keep them open, I can still see these things. And they're getting worse. About a week ago, I saw one of these flashes of light when I was looking at my dog. What freaked me out about it this time is that the flash of light seemed to hover just over my dog. The flash of light just hung there, distorting and warping like smoke from a burned-out match. I watched in horror when the shape seemed to have sprouted an arm and reached out toward my dog. Of course, this all happened in a fraction of a second, so it was hard to tell whether my eyes were playing tricks on me or not. The next thing I knew, I heard my dog yelping and running away from me. He's never acted like that before. I ran after him and I found him hiding under my bed. Of course, when he ran away, the shape disappeared. The problem is that now the shapes are visible almost constantly. It seems like they're everywhere. Sometimes I'll see them in my peripheral vision, and other times they seem to be hovering above the room. I don't understand what's happening to me. I should be able to wake up and go to sleep without having to worry about seeing these horrible things reaching out and grabbing me. But I guess it doesn't matter what I want. These things aren't going anywhere. I've tried to ignore them, but they're so persistent. Every time I try to focus on something else, I start seeing them again, and it's becoming harder and harder to concentrate. A couple days after the incident with my dog, the shapes started taking on more detail, sort of like when something comes into your line of sight from your periphery. I don't like what I've seen. I can almost make out faces, but they seem distorted, almost the way they might look under a thin sheet. It seems like they have gaping mouths and furrowed brows. If they made a sound, I'm sure they would be screaming. There are days when I feel like this is just a bad dream, and I can wake myself up anytime I want, but I know it's not a dream, and I'm in this situation because I didn't control myself when I had the chance. What I feared seems to have come true. I could hardly see anything when I woke up this morning. Anything but the shapes, that is. And the shapes are becoming less shape-like and much more defined. I can't help it though. I'm addicted to the feeling. What started off as a weird optical effect I was seeing from damaging my eyes has now become my reality. I really don't like what I'm seeing, but it feels so good. It feels like all my stress and tension is melting away. I feel like I can finally see clearly for the first time, even though I can hardly see at all. I know that by the end of the week, these things will probably be all that I can see. If it didn't feel so good, I'd be terrified. I get the feeling they've always been here, but I just couldn't see them. The funny thing is that they're everywhere. They're in everything. They are in every single detail of my life. I can barely remember what my face looks like anymore. It's ironic though, because now I can see their faces clearer than I've ever seen anything. Their eye sockets are huge and shallow, like big empty holes that look like they were designed to let you see right through them to whatever's beyond. But there's nothing beyond them. Nothing but darkness. Their mouths are wide open, with sharp teeth that look like they could tear me apart in a second. They could never do that though, right? I can't tell if they even have bodies I could touch, or if they're actually made of light. Can you actually touch light? Can you even feel it? Or is it just me now, feeling it? Maybe I'm the only one who can feel it, since I'm the only one who sees it. Still, I'm sure they would never hurt me. I probably should have listened to my optometrist. There was a time when I'd probably be terrified seeing these things if it didn't feel so good. To be honest though, it feels incredible. When I sit here and think about it, what I can see of their eyes is almost welcoming. Surely they're not screaming. They're laughing. I get the feeling I'm going to be seeing them for a long time, so I'm glad they seem so nice. I really hope that sometime soon I find a way to hear them though. I'd love to know what they're laughing at.
Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
I can't believe I even have to write this, but here I am. I'm hoping to get some advice, so if anyone has any recommendations, I'm all ears. I'm not posting this from my main account for obvious reasons. I think I messed up spectacularly, and other than the others involved in the situation, nobody else knows about this yet. I just got back home from a long weekend of camping with friends, and the one thing I didn't want to do was check my phone while I was there. So when I checked it today, I saw that I had an email waiting for me from our IT department at work. The subject line said something along the lines of, "Forward, confirm your password change." I assumed they were just trying to be proactive and make sure we weren't using passwords like password or 12345678. So I ignored them until after work. When I did come into the office, I opened up my email on my computer instead of checking it on my phone, since I knew I would be able to see more text that way. That's how I found out about what happened this morning. It started around 7 a.m. when someone sent an email to the whole company that said something along the lines of, "Hey, you might want to change your passwords." We've been getting these emails almost every Monday lately, because apparently they're just sending the same message over and over again to all the different departments. But this time, instead of clicking the link in the email, I did a quick internet search and found out it was a phishing attack. It wasn't their actual email address, but one very similar. Not even close, actually. They were asking us to update our passwords by logging into a website that looked exactly like our own internal email system, except with a slightly different layout. They also included a fake security certificate to make it look legit, which was probably why we hadn't noticed anything wrong with the messages before now. I could tell right away that it was fake, though. My IT department is pretty good at keeping things secure, so I would have known if someone had hacked into our servers. I reported it to them as soon as I realized what had happened, and they took care of it within an hour. But obviously, some people were already affected. There were over 100 false emails sent out to employees in the first 10 minutes. Some of those emails contained malicious files, which meant the hackers were able to take control of some people's computers remotely, without them even realizing it. I don't know how many were affected, but the company hasn't released any official numbers yet. I'm just glad that I went with my gut and didn't click the link. Anyway, this is where I messed up. I told my boss that I thought the email was suspicious, and he asked me to forward him the email. He wanted to contact our IT department and make sure that everything was okay. I never imagined that he would do something like forwarding the email to everyone else, but that's exactly what he did. I guess he thought it was just another phishing attempt and that no harm would come of it. Well, I was wrong. Within an hour of forwarding this email to my boss, I started getting frantic emails and texts from just about all of my contacts at work. People were mad, and not just a little bit. My thought was that there was no way a phishing email deserved that much backlash. After all, I wasn't the one that forwarded it to everyone. Here's the problem. It wasn't a phishing email. When I finally got a call from my closest work friend, Paul, he was as upset as everyone else and asked me why I'd send something like that out. I still didn't understand why he was being so serious about something IT could probably deal with, until he told me what he saw in the email. He told me that when he opened the email, the first thing he saw was a picture of his wife, Christina, who works with us. She was alone in her office, and it was dark outside. His eyes immediately went to the timestamp of the email. It was 12:01 a.m. Now, Paul doesn't use his work computer for personal stuff, and he always logs off of his email when he leaves for the day. Because of that, there was no way someone could access his personal photos from just his work computer. He was freaked out that someone took a picture of Christina while she was working alone in the office. That wasn't the end of it, though. Since she works with us, Christina also got the email, but with a photo of Paul in the background. At first, Paul thought it was a prank, but he couldn't figure out why anyone would be doing that to him. This was enough for me to check in with some of the others who were frantically emailing and texting me. Each time, I heard the same thing. No two people seemed to have gotten the same photo, but they had all been sent pictures of various people from the office when they were alone and didn't know someone was watching them. A few people got photos of themselves, and some of our colleagues received pictures of other people, usually people that they worked closely with. Everyone was freaking out, but no one knew what to do. For some reason, the hackers weren't just taking photos of employees. In some of the photos, they said there was a creepy person standing behind them, or in front of them, silently watching them. The last thing you want is to think that someone is stalking you, especially when you can't see them. I couldn't believe people were getting these photos, and no one knew what to do about it. I tried to get through to my boss, but he wouldn't answer his phone. I called him several times, but he ignored the calls. Finally, I left him a voicemail asking him to please return my call, and that I thought it was important, but he never returned the call. What I didn't understand at the time was why everyone was so mad at me. Sure, I forwarded the email, but I didn't send it to everyone. I only sent it to my boss. I should have been able to trust him to handle this. He was the one who asked me to forward it, and I assumed he would be smart enough not to do anything stupid. He's a big guy, and he's really good at his job. I figured he'd do the right thing, and if there was any danger, he would let me know. Instead, he forwarded the email to everyone else, and then he went home early. Fast forward to this afternoon, and I still hadn't heard from my boss, so I figured I would send him a text so he didn't need to call me back. He was really mad when he finally responded, asking me what the hell is wrong with me, that he trusted me, and that there would be consequences. I mean, come on. It was just a phishing email, and he was the one who asked me to forward it to him. That's when I realized why he was so upset. He stopped replying, other than sending a single photo of himself at his desk. He must have been really upset that I had a friend take a picture of us together. I wasn't even fully in the picture, because the office door was blocking me. I've always wanted us to take a picture together, considering I take pictures with all my friends. At this point, I realized why everyone must have been so mad at me, since my boss was so bent out of shape over it. Sometimes, I just have to seize the opportunity. I mean, candid photos really are the best way to capture a moment. Maybe some people just don't like their picture being taken. So, with all that said, was I in the wrong? As a child, I was always drawn to the forest behind my house. It was a place of mystery and adventure, and I would often spend hours exploring its hidden trails and hidden groves. One day, as I was wandering through the forest, I stumbled upon a strange log that had been split in half by a fallen tree. As I peered into the log, something caught my eye. A small puppet, no bigger than my hand, was peering back at me from the darkness. At first, I was scared and ran back to my house, but the next day, I couldn't resist the urge to go back to the log and see the puppet again. This time, I brought a flashlight with me and carefully peered inside. To my amazement, the puppet was still there, staring at me with its beady black eyes. It was incredibly lifelike, with delicate fingers and tiny joints that seemed to move on their own. Over the next few days, the puppet began to follow me wherever I went in the forest. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but soon I realized that the puppet was real. It would hide behind trees and sneak up on me when I least expected it, always watching me with its beady black eyes. As time passed, I began to feel more and more uneasy about the puppet. It was always there, watching me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to me. One day, I finally mustered up the courage to confront the puppet. I grabbed it by the arm and demanded to know why it was following me. To my shock, the puppet responded in a tiny, childlike voice.
Because you're me, silly. I'm the baby version of you.
I was horrified. The puppet was right. It looked exactly like me as a baby, right down to the smallest detail. I had been followed by my own baby self all along. I dropped the puppet and ran back to my house, never venturing into the forest again. To this day, I can't shake the memory of the puppet, and the thought of it still out there watching me sends shivers down my spine.